Hello and welcome into another episode of Preps to Pros. I'm Cooper Petagna alongside Andrew Ivins, and we got a great show for you today. We're going to get you started with a little bit of juice, and then we're going to talk the team of the week this week, who we selected. That is the Florida Gators. Billy Napier, the number 10 ranked recruiting class. A lot of momentum. Another big game this weekend in the Swamp against number 20 Mark Stoops and the Kentucky Wildcats. We'll also preview Texas versus Alabama. A lot of young playmakers in that game. And then we'll wrap it up with the 2-minute drill. A lot to talk about. Louisville, big game this week. Also, Arkansas, South Carolina, a lot on the line, recruiting implications. So that's what we do. But Drew, good to have you back, baby. Episode 16, we're slowly crawling to episode 20, but good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, Sweet 16. I see you're still on the road, not your typical backdrop. I'm wondering, when is that Kid Cudi album going to return? I'm desperately awaiting, or another record in your backdrop.
You know, it was a really good opportunity. Shout out to fiance, her architecture background, a lot of beautiful exhibits behind me, but that's neither here nor there. But Drew, a lot to talk about and a lot going on in your home state, in the state of Florida, that we love to talk about. And if you're on the Twitter sphere and your needs in terms of recruiting, you might have heard a little noise last night about top 247 offensive lineman Roderick, Kearney, Florida State commit. And it seems like there's some noise with him. The Florida Gators, obviously a team sniffing around in the backyard, but also maybe the Georgia Bulldogs there too. Drew, what you got?
Yeah, you know, Florida has picked up 2 crystal ball flip predictions for Mr. Kearney here in the past 72 hours. Roderick was a surprise visitor in the Swamp this past Saturday for that game against Utah. Now, he's still committed to Florida State. He actually put out a bit of a cryptic tweet late Tuesday night saying that he's not doing any interviews. He's still committed to FSU, but Florida's definitely in there. I believe the Gators are expecting him to be back in the Swamp this Saturday. And while I think the Gators have some traction after working the phones, I think you also got to keep an eye on Georgia here. Remember, Georgia, the Bulldogs, they have a ton of ties to that Jacksonville area. Obviously, they traditionally play the Gators there in the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. But Todd Hartley, he's an ace recruiter. He's got some ties to that area. Stacey Searles, the new offensive line coach. So I think maybe Roderick's looking around a little bit. Not sure it's a slam dunk to Florida, but keep an eye on Georgia. The Bulldogs are trying to round out that offensive line class, and Roderick Kearney is the guy that Stacey Searles, Kirby Smart, and the rest of that offensive staff have circled. So we'll see what happens. I don't know if Alex Atkins is going to lose this one just yet, but there's definitely still some twists and some turns with Kearney and his recruitment 4 months before that early signing period.
If you're a Florida fan, this has to be pretty refreshing going head-to-head against Mike Norvell on a committed player to the Florida State Seminoles, and then also battling Georgia as well. So Florida off to a very good start, not only during the season, but on the recruiting trail as well. But let's go back to Florida State, and let's talk about Oyster Boyz legend. That is Hykeem Williams, top 247 receiver, one of the best in the country, the number 5 receiver, and all the way in. He went on an unofficial visit to a neutral site game in New Orleans this past weekend and got to see Florida State get the victory against LSU. Where do things stand with Florida State and Hykeem Williams?
Well, I'm going to raise some eyebrows here. I think Florida State has a better chance of picking up a commitment from Hykeem Williams in a few weeks than Texas A&M does. And I know that's a bit surprising because the Aggies have been billed as the team to beat for Hykeem for the better part of the past 5-6 months. But I think Mike Norvell, Ron Dugans, and the Seminoles have done a ton they've caught up significantly here in recent weeks. And Hykeem, he was in New Orleans. He loved it. He couldn't talk with the coaches, but said pretty much every Florida State fan showed him some type of love. I think the quote he used was that S word was electrifying, talking about the late rally win for the Seminoles with that blocked field goal. So he's going to get to Pittsburgh this upcoming weekend. I've always billed Pittsburgh as a dark horse in the recruitment. Still think you got to watch out for Tyquan Underwood, who has been recruiting Hykeem since his days at Rutgers. Georgia's in there as well. And then Alabama. Hykeem was talking up Alabama a little bit to me yesterday. I think that's a notable thing. And we've said this in the past with Hykeem. You know, he's going to make a commitment September 23rd on CBS Sports HQ. He's still probably going to take some visits after that. He's got an official visit set up with Florida State Thanksgiving weekend, talked about taking an official visit to Texas A&M in December. So he's going to announce. I think Florida State is surging in this recruitment. We'll see how Pittsburgh goes this weekend, and then he's going to go Texas A&M right before he decides. So big news, FSU making a move with Hykeem Williams.
Drew, I'm smiling because you casually just dropped that Hykeem Williams is starting to talk up Alabama and Nick Saban. So certainly we'll keep an eye on that one. You know, the filler word there for Hykeem Williams, I think in that situation, which we talked about in pre-production, was ish. That ish was electrifying. I think he's going to have an electrifying recruitment. It's going to be a lot of twists and turns. We've talked about that one as well. But Drew, let's head to the swamp now, and a guy that the Florida Gators, Billy Napier, seem to be chipping away at slowly but surely, and Alabama's in this race as well, but that's the number 4 player in all of the country, and that is top 247 defensive back Cormani McClain, the number 1 defensive player in the 2023 cycle. He was in Gainesville this past weekend to see Florida beat Utah. Where are things kind of trending with Cormani McClain?
Well, I love my crystal ball pick for the Gators here, and I know Steve Wiltfong, director of recruiting, he also fired one in for Florida late Saturday night. I think Florida's in the driver's seat right now. It doesn't sound like Cormani's going to return this weekend for the Kentucky game, but I wouldn't be surprised if he got back later in the season, possibly for that meeting in mid-October against LSU. By all accounts, Cormani loved his experience inside the swamp, and I was talking to one of the people inside his camp, and they said the most notable thing is after a few of those Florida touchdowns, there was a few players from the Gators that ran over and pointed directly at Cormani, who was sitting in the stands, and said, "Come to Florida." And I think that's pretty unique. I've heard stories of that happening at schools like Alabama, but not at Florida yet. Maybe that speaks to the culture that Billy Napier has created. So Cormani's going to take an official to Alabama at some point down the line. I think Miami's hanging in that recruitment by a sliver of a thread. But right now, Florida, Alabama battle. I like the Gators at this stage in the process. We'll see how the season goes. But that win for Billy Napier, that signature victory over Utah, has done wonders in that recruitment.
Everything coming up Gators right now, and Florida's certainly trying to ride that wave of momentum on the recruiting trail as well. And Drew, producer Jesse said, "Hey, I got a segment for you guys every week from now on. Now we're going to pick a team that was the team of the week, and then we're going to do a deep dive into the recruiting class." So the team of the week this past week, the Florida Gators beating Utah 29-26. We thought that was a game that we had circled coming into it, and obviously a big win. We talked about one of the biggest winners on the recruiting trail, if they won that game, was going to be Florida. So now here they are sitting at number 10 in the country, and we're going to break them down from top to bottom. And Drew, we're going to do this by position. So let's start with the guys up front in a position at the line of scrimmage that Florida really needs to get right. They put a big emphasis on that position, but only 2 commitments right now, and 2 guys that we like, higher ranked 3 stars, and that's Bryce Lovett and Najee Harris. What are your thoughts on those 2 guys?
Well, I think these guys fit what Billy Napier, Robert Sale, and the rest of that offensive staff want to do. They're big bodies that can fit into a power rushing scheme. And if you watch the Gators against the Utes on Saturday night, you know that they want to run the football. You know that they're going to use multiple running backs to accomplish that task. And I think Bryce Lovett, who's actually young for his grade, and Najee Harris, they're 2 of the best in the Sunshine State when it comes to finding leverage and pushing other bodies out of the way. So I like that take for them. But you can tell that Florida, there's still some meat on the bone. They still want to kind of round out this class. It's not surprising that they're in on Roderick, Kearney, and I think they're going to try to make some flips. Cooper, what do you think of Najee Harris? I know you're a big fan of him. You always talk him up to me.
They're not sexy players when you look at Najee Harris and Bryce Lovett, with all due respect to both of those guys, but they're big interior linemen. What we've seen a lot at Georgia and at Alabama, I think guys that you need that are necessity in the SEC to win at the highest level. So I think these are 2 guys that are more fit type of players within the Florida program. They're going to need some work in terms of what they need to do to get their bodies right at the next level. But in terms of that fit at Florida and what their level of confidence is going to be at the next level, I like both of those guys and how they fit in their program. But Drew, let's turn to the signal caller, arguably the most important position in this class, and that's top 247 quarterback Marcus Stokes from Nice High School. They flipped him early on in the process. pretty recently from Penn State, and a guy that they were excited about. We wondered where Florida would turn in this process. And Drew, I know you got a pretty, I would say, I don't know, there was some debate on the pro comp side, but you got one that kind of fascinates me a little bit.
Yeah, I compare Marcus Stokes to Kenny Pickett, obviously, who just went in the first round of the NFL draft, could start this season for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But when I see these two, it's similar play styles, and they're high risk takers. They're not afraid to challenge tight windows. I also think if there's any quarterback in the class of 2023 that would fake a slide, Marcus Stokes is that guy. He's just got that laid back attitude. At the same time, though, he's super fiery. And, you know, he's going through a bit of a difficult senior season at Nice. He lost some of his top weapons. They're 0-2 right now, the Nice Panthers. That's obviously where Tim Tebow went to high school. Stokes is only completing 42% of his passes, but he's thrown for 365 yards, 2 touchdowns. He's also ran for 3 touchdowns. And I think this is just kind of what Marcus Stokes is. It's going to take some time for him to develop and learn how to protect the football. But man, if he's on, he's one of the best, I think, at just letting it rip in the 2023 class. And I think if you're Florida, you absolutely take that. Thinking big picture with the Gators, though, you know, do they still have to go into the transfer portal? AR-15, Anthony Richardson, I know we're not supposed to call him that, but he was awesome on Saturday night. A lot of people are projecting him to be a possible day 1 pick. If that were the case, I think the Gators might need to grab a veteran signal caller, because Stokes is a guy that you need to stash on that roster, let him mature a little bit, and then give him the green light to go out there and throw it around.
I agree. I think Marcus Stokes is going to need some time to sit and develop. What we've seen from him, he is a very free-flowing player. And what I mean by that is a guy that likes to get outside of the pocket, likes to improvise a lot. I think the comparison for me is former Ole Miss standout. That's Matt Corral. I think a guy that really used his legs well, really not known as a runner, but a guy that can beat you with his legs if given the opportunity. I think that's Marcus Stokes as well, and a guy that's probably a better fit playing off platform than in the pocket right now. I think that's the biggest part of his game where Marcus Stokes really needs to mature, but nonetheless a really good get for Billy Napier in the Florida Gators, and a guy that they can really start to work around and build around at the next level. But Drew, let's get to the rest of the offensive skill position. You got top 247 running back Trayon Webb. You also have some guys at the receiver position, Aiden Mazzell, the speedster, Eugene Wilson, Andy Jean, Tyree Patterson, a number of guys, Creed Whitmore as well, who's kind of the utility man. I know I just named a couple of guys in Florida kind of loading up on these gadget, utility, versatile players, but is there one or two guys that kind of stand out to you from that group?
Sure. Let's start with Eugene Wilson. I think when I look at Florida's offense and what they have at wide receiver, they need chunk players, guys that can pick up yardage after the catch. And I think Eugene Wilson is one of the best at that in the class of 2023. He's a 4.5 kid on the Lasers. Dad won a pair of Super Bowls with the New England Patriots. I love his senior tape so far. Cooper, I know me and you were just on a rankings call. I suggested him as a guy to potentially play in an All-American game. I think he's that good. And look, Florida's kind of searching for that Kadarius Toney. And I don't know if Eugene Wilson's the next Kadarius Toney, but I think his ability to make people miss in a phone booth is pretty similar to that of Toney, or at least, comparable. I think if you're looking for maybe more of a better fit in a player comp, what about Antonio Callaway, the former Florida wide receiver who obviously ran into some trouble, ended up with the Cleveland Browns and is no longer part of the league. But Antonio Callaway is a guy that Florida, they created touches for him, jet sweeps, quick little short slot routes over the middle, screen passes. You can even hand him the ball. And I think Eugene Wilson can do that for Florida. So I love him. Cooper, who do you like on that offensive side when it comes to the skill players?
Well, I'm a big Creed Whitmore guy, and this is a guy that I think is a utility player, a three-phase player, plays quarterback right now, but also a guy that can play receiver or play safety. Also gives you some return value as well in the punt return and in the kick return game as well. So I think this is a guy, the more you study him, the more he can do. I think he's a really high floor player, but he's just a football player. And on top of that, I think he's got more athleticism and upside to materialize at the next level. I think he's everything that Billy Napier wants in a football player. We talk about that toughness, we talk about that football player mentality, but the versatility as well. Sub 1100 meter guy. I think this guy is a playmaker. I'm not really sure where he's even going to play. I think right now they're expecting him to play on the offensive side of the ball at the receiver position. And a guy that he kind of reminded me of was Randall Cobb, who used to do it all at Kentucky in Lexington, now with the Green Bay Packers, and a guy that they kind of use in that utility role. So you talk about him, and Drew, you also talk about some of the weapons that they had. Eugene Wilson, Andy Jean, a guy that we have higher ranked as a 3-star with some developmental upside there as well. And they like Tyree Patterson enough to take him really early in the process. So Kerry Colbert, the new receivers coach at Florida, coming over from USC, he worked with Billy Napier at Alabama. Those two are very familiar with each other and know what they want at that position. They had to get more talented there, and I think they've done that this season. So if you're looking at Florida on the offensive side of the ball and what they've done, I think Marcus Stokes is a guy that you can build around. It's going to take some time, but that receiver position to me is where they've kind of hit it out of the park. And if you can get Roderick Kearney, flip him from Florida State, you're in business there as well, because I like Lovett and I like Najee Harris too. But Drew, let's go to the defensive side of the ball. And to me, listen, if there was one position that gets me very excited when talking about the Florida Gators, that is the defensive line. And that's starting with Kelby Collins from Gardendale, top 247 defensive lineman. You pair him with Cameron James as well, a guy that you are very bullish on. Will Norman in there as well. Gavin Hill, another guy. TJ Searcy, who is a very tradesy player out of the state of Georgia. I mean, kudos to the Florida Gators and what they've done up.
In Florida, I mean, I'll say this. When I was at Friday Night Lights talking with one of my contacts, the first thing they mentioned about that camp and that recruiting weekend was it all had to do with the defensive line. Look, Florida knew that they needed to get longer up front. They wanted to look like Alabama and Georgia in the trenches. And those two schools, the Crimson Tide and the Bulldogs, what they do very well is they run that mint front. What is that? It's 2 4-eyes, a true nose guard, or a true nose tackle, nose guard, and then an elite edge player. And Florida feels like if they are going to compete for SEC titles, they have to be able to run that front. And so far, so good. We talked about Kelby Collins, who had that epic commitment here on 24/7 Sports on the YouTube channel. I like him. I like Cameron James and his developmental upside. You know, trying to find a player comparison for him. Adetokunbo Ogundeji is a kid for the Atlanta Falcons who is projected to be an outside linebacker for them this year. I see Cam James, some Adetokunbo Ogundeji and Cameron James. I actually saw Ade, as they called him, when he was being recruited by Notre Dame, and it's a very similar build to Cameron James. So I think Cameron James is an excellent take for them. My question is how do they line or round out this defensive line group? You got Keon Keeley, who's expected to be on campus this weekend for an unofficial visit. That news comes from Swamp 247's Blake Alderman. They're also in it for Quay Russaw. And then Samuel Mpemba is a guy that I don't think gets talked about enough with Florida, the elite edge rusher out of IMG Academy. But what the Gators have done in the trenches is super impressive. Caden McDonald, another kid out of the Atlanta Metro, I think he could be that zero or nose guard for the Gators. It's an impressive group. And then Isaiah Nixon, he's another edge rusher that they flipped over there from UCF. If there is one position group where I think Florida does need to kind of kick it along or get some new names on the board, it is linebacker. Jaden Robinson is a kid that they recently flipped from South Carolina, right there in Lake City, Columbia. They like what Jaden Robinson brings to the table, but I think they need to maybe add 1 or 2 more off-ball linebackers to this class. 2 names I would keep an eye on: Malik Bryant, the kid from Orlando Jones. He's committed to Miami right now, but still evaluating his options. And then, of course, you got Grayson Howard right there in Jacksonville, who's committed to South Carolina. I think Florida's going to keep chipping away at with him.
It never sleeps. We have these crazy commitments. Malik Bryant down to Miami, Florida to commit to Miami, and now to potentially keep it open. He's still going to evaluate his options. But Drew, I'll say this about the defensive line. Right now, we have Kelby Collins ranked the number 173 player in the country. You also have Cameron James right behind him at number 179. It would surprise me if those guys are not closer to 100 than 200 when this is all said and done. Two guys that we like a lot. And with Cameron James, you kind of look at this long 6'6", 260-pound plus frame, and a guy that kind of reminded me of Peyton Turner with the New Orleans Saints that the Saints took in the first round at the end of, last year from the University of Houston. So a lot to like there with Cameron James, Kelby Collins, Billy Napier. His focus will be about keeping those guys in the boat. But Drew, to finish it off in this class, in the secondary, Corey Raymond has done a tremendous job, and Jakeem Jackson, a guy that you have long been a fan of, in the boat for the Florida Gators. Also, Jordan Castile at the safety position, a guy that's got a lot of versatility there as well. But what do you think about the job that Corey Raymond's done with that Florida secondary?
It shouldn't be surprising that they've recruited this well. I mean, Corey Raymond was known for what he did in the secondary at LSU. I think a lot of people were surprised he left Baton Rouge for Florida, but Billy Napier called at the right time, and now he's seeing the fruits of his labor pay off when it comes to defensive back recruiting. I love Jakeem Jackson, and it's funny, Cooper. Remember a few months ago I said, hey, who's going to get Jakeem Jackson and Dijon Johnson? Because I thought Cormani McClain was headed to Alabama, and that would be the next group. Well, Jakeem Jackson's already committed to the Gators. Dijon Mustard Johnson, he's trending towards the Gators. And like I said earlier on the show, I like Florida for Cormani McClain. So you take those three, add in Sharif Denson, another four-star corner out of the Jacksonville area, and the Gators could have as good of a defensive back class as anyone in the country. Super impressive what they've done so far. We like all these guys. I mean, Jordan Castile, he's the fifth DB in the room. I think a lot of schools, he'd be the headliner in their DB group. So impressive work by Corey Raymond.
Aaron Gates also in the fold for the Florida Gators. So if you're a Florida fan, a lot to be excited about. That was the top to bottom recap, but I'm kind of looking, if you're Florida right now and you got another top 20 matchup this week against Kentucky at home, I mean, the momentum continues to build if they can find a way to win this game. I mean, you look at the players that they have left on the board, Drew. You have Cormani McClain, the number 4 player in the country, Keon Keeley, another 5-star, and then Cedric Baxter, who's in 5-star territory. We didn't even talk about him, but I believe he was in Gainesville for an unofficial visit this past weekend, the Texas commitment. So Florida still working on him. Roderick Kearney as well, the Florida State commitment, and Dijon Johnson, the former Ohio State defensive back commitment. Drew, is it crazy when it's all said and done, Florida could be sitting here with a definitive top 5 recruiting class?
I think so. I mean, we'll see how these games play out, what happens this Saturday in the Swamp against Kentucky, but there are plenty of what I'll call bullets out there for the Gators to have some staying power. You mentioned Cedric Baxter. What about Richard Young, the 5-star running back committed to Alabama? He was in the Swamp for that opener against Utah, and I think that's interesting because while the Gators have Trayon Webb committed, who's off to a very good start as a senior, I still think they want to add one more elite back to this class. Cedric Baxter certainly could be that guy. Richard Young could be that guy. And then, we'll see what they do on the offensive line. That's kind of the position group I have circled. What is Billy Napier and his staff going to do? And I think if you're a Florida fan, you kind of got to trust Napier and those coaches. They had a ton of guys selected when they were at Louisiana, a few different offensive linemen. So I think senior evaluations are going to be huge for Florida when it comes to the offensive line and when it comes to linebackers. And Cooper, you've worked in that same kind of recruiting department with that idea. I mean, the senior evaluations will be big for Florida. They're going to make a lot of decisions based on that. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're pretty aggressive with some late risers.
Well, we've talked about it. They were one of the teams that has benefited the most from the early identification process. And to me, we talked about Florida building their class from the ground up and really starting from the back end. And that was guys with maybe not as much oomph in their names. And that was Bryce Lovett, and that was Najee Harris, and that was Creed Whitmore and Tyree James and Gavin Hill. And the more we've studied these guys, the more we've liked these guys. So credit to Florida and their staff getting these guys to campus, working them out. They've obviously showcased their talents there enough for Florida to go ahead and give those guys the green light. Now you're starting to see them really kind of season in the top tier talent as they try to finish with some of the top players in the country, like we mentioned, Cormani McClain, Keon Keeley, Cedric Baxter, and so on and so forth. So you got to give it to Billy Napier. And that being said, they still have the transfer portal where they were very active last year, and I expect them to be active again, especially on the offensive line. So if you're a Florida Gator fan, like we've said, trust the process. I think Billy Napier has earned that. And as they continue to win football games, if they surprise some people on the gridiron this year, I think that's only going to benefit them on the recruiting trail as well. So there you have it for the Florida Gators recap, top to bottom, the number 10 class in the country, Billy Napier and company, looking for more as well. And before we transition to the next segment, if you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe to the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe, like, leave a comment, any feedback, please. We love it. Constructive criticism, all of that is super positive for us. But Drew, we got a great game to get down to in Austin, Texas at 11 a.m. I can't believe it's probably still going to be a hot one. But Texas Longhorns hosting Alabama Crimson Tide, and Steve Sarkisian, who used to coach under Nick Saban, will now get his shot at one of the greatest coaches of all time. And this is a 20-point line for the Crimson Tide. But there are so many storylines going into this game, and there's so many preview magazines, and there's so many people out there like our boy Josh Pate who do an incredible job of breaking these games down. We figured we'd stay on our lane and we'd talk about some of the potential impact freshmen in these games. And Drew, I want to start with the Texas Longhorns. This is a team that finished with a top 5 recruiting class last year. We knew it was going to be a youthful experience this year, and that they were going to lean on some guys on the offensive line early. Looks like they're doing that, starting left tackle Kelvin Banks, a 5-star for us per 24/7 Sports. And then you got Cole Hudson as well, starting at right guard. What are your thoughts on what these guys are going to see up front with a very, very stout Alabama defense?
Well, I hope they're ready to fend off Will Anderson and Dallas Turner. I mean, I don't know if you could scheme up a more difficult matchup for those two. It kind of reminds me of back in 2019 when Florida and Miami squared off in Orlando, and the Hurricanes elected to start Zion Nelson at left tackle. He finished the night, I think, with a 0.0 grade from Pro Football Focus for pass protection, gave up something like 12 sacks on the night, or maybe it was 12 pressures. I'm kind of getting confused here. So no, it's interesting that Steve Sarkisian, Kyle Flood, and that offensive staff are investing and trusting these young guys, and it's going to kind of be a baptism for those two up front, trying to defend those guys. I'm really interested in them. And then when we're talking about Alabama's front, what about Hykeem Otis? You know, he might not be a guy that's getting after the quarterback per se, but he's a big body that's going to eat up some of those blocks and allow linebackers to run free. And Hykeem Otis, Cooper, I know we're eventually going to get into it. He's been one of the more interesting evaluations in recent memory. Last year at the Under Armour Future 50, he was 6'5", 388 pounds. He was that big. I remember him. They had him in wide receiver cleats at that camp, and I think he blew one of them out with his size 17 shoes as he tried to cut. He's a big body, but he's someone that got to Alabama. And I always say this, the guys that are, further along from a physical standpoint have already been developed. Those are the scariest ones in the Crimson Tide's weight room, because Nick Saban, Dr. Matt Rhea, and all those guys, they get the most out of them. And Hykeem Otis has slimmed down, getting starter reps. We saw him play against Utah State, and he's super impressive. So my eyes will be on him. Is he going to be a guy that's going to make an impact and play 30, 40, 50 snaps this season for the Crimson Tide by the time they get to that Texas A&M game?
I mean, I got to be honest. He's kind of been the biggest surprise to me all offseason. I mean, you talked about his weight, and I thought he kind of carried it pretty well for that size. I mean, you're talking over 380 pounds, but he was a really smooth mover. Now I think listed right around 340 pounds. So the job that he's done, credit to him and the work that he's put in. The same with Alabama's nutritional staff and strength and conditioning program. So to get him ready to play, and now he's a guy that's potentially going to make an impact very early on for Alabama. Those type of guys with that type of size and that type of rare athleticism are really hard to find. Alabama has a lot of confidence in their program and being able to get a guy like that right. To see it happen so quickly, to me, has been a surprise. But we're looking back at where we had him, number 92 per 24/7 Sports last year in the 2022 cycle, the number 13 defensive lineman. And you're kind of scratching your head already. Wow, this guy's at 340 pounds. So we've kind of seen that accelerated growth in terms of him being able to acclimate quickly at the next level. So Hykeem Otis is definitely going to be a guy that we're going to have our eyes on. But Drew, a couple of the playmakers and a guy that you're familiar with, two guys out of our area and a guy already making some headlines. That is Kobe Prentice out of the state of Alabama, an in-state prospect and a top 100 prospect for us last year per 24/7 Sports. But 5 receptions last week for 70 yards. And another guy that got some snaps, didn't see any receptions, but that was Isaiah Bond out of Buford, that I know there was kind of some conversation. Is he going to play offense or defense? He's been playing early for the Tide on the offensive side of the ball.
Well, let's start with Kobe real quick. And all those people that say, hey, these summer camps where they're in shirts and shorts, they don't mean anything. Well, Kobe was a guy last June, so June of 2021. He had really nothing going for him in his recruitment. He went to Florida State's mega camp, ran a super fast time in the 40-yard dash. Alabama found out. He was in Tuscaloosa a few weeks later, and story over. Nick Saban of the Crimson Tide got that one done super fast. So not surprised that he's playing. If you read anything about Alabama's preseason camp, you knew he had a few good scrimmages, and he's going to be the next big playmaker. Now with Isaiah Bond, his recruitment was one to follow. At one point, seemed like he was the silent to Miami, commits to Florida, locked in with the Florida Gators. They're telling him he's going to be a wide receiver. Then Dan Mullen leaves. Billy Gonzalez, the wide receivers coach, leaves. He opens it back up. Alabama's right there.
Lead in Lex. Funny. Young gets away to the far side.
He was going to be, or there was talk of him being a defensive back. Nick Saban wanted him to cover some of these fast slot receivers. I think Kirby Smart and Georgia staff thought the same thing, but he wanted to be a wideout. Georgia 6A state champ in the 100 and 200 as a junior, so he can without a doubt fly. I'm looking forward to seeing both those guys play on Saturday and get on the field. And I'll say this with Bond, I almost forgot. He was flirting with Texas at one time and almost took an official visit there. So I'm sure Steve Sarkisian and those guys are very familiar with him.
It's going to be a lot of fireworks, offensive fireworks on both sides of the ball. I'm excited to see Quinn Ewers in this game. This is really going to be the first test for him. Obviously, they played Louisiana Monroe last week, and all was pretty much what you would expect out of that performance. Jatavion Sanders at the tight end position had a really good game last week, and then Bijan Robinson, but a 20-point line right now for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And this is going to be a really good barometer for Texas. But, Drew, the last freshman in this game, Jalen Gilbo, and a guy I got to give a shout out to our national recruiting analyst, Gabe Brooks, who covers the state of Texas, but a guy that he was very, very bullish on. Saw a lot of snaps this past week against Louisiana Monroe and Pete Kwiatkowski's defense. 37 snaps for him, most of them at the nickel position. He's going to have his hands full, and that might be a freshman-on-freshman matchup you see there with Kobe Prentice, Isaiah Bond, and Jalen Gilbo. So Alabama, Texas, from a personnel standpoint, I think for us this is going to be a really exciting game, and that will be on 11 a.m. Central Time on Saturday. So a lot to focus on there and a lot to be excited about. But, Drew, our 4-minute offense carries us to our 2-minute drill in a couple games that we have circled and we're excited about. And Drew, for us, we spent a lot of time over the offseason. If anybody watches this show consistently, I think they would say we talk a lot about Louisville, and I think a lot of that is due to the connection that they have in the state of Florida. They've done a tremendous job in that state this year recruiting, and Scott Satterfield has certainly had an impact in that state as the Cardinal have the number 17 ranked recruiting class in the country, but they lose their opening game of the season 31-7 to Syracuse in the Carrier Dome. And now they got to come back and they got to go to the bounce house and play Central Florida. And this is going to be a game for Gus Malzahn. They got a really big opportunity here to start 2-0 and continue that momentum, not only on the field, but on the recruiting trail as well. But Drew, for Scott Satterfield, I mean, you hate to say it this early in the season, but is this a must-win game for Louisville?
Yes, that is the answer. No, I mean, this was a storyline coming into the year. What is going to happen with Satterfield? Is he going to be Louisville's coach moving forward after this year? Remember, they ended last season with losses to Kentucky and then Air Force in the bowling game, in the bowl game. So it's been 3 straight L's for Louisville, and if they don't beat UCF on Friday night, they could really be staring at 1-3 possibly 2-4 heading into the bye week. Next 5 games for Louisville, Florida State, USF, that should be a win. Then they go at BC, at UVA. The tail end of the schedule is where it gets really hard. They got games against Wake Forest, Pittsburgh, Clemson, NC State, and Kentucky. I mean, Louisville right now has the nation's number 17 ranked recruiting class. That group includes Reuben Owens. I highlighted them as a loser last week when it came to recruiting, and I think there's some of these schools out here might smell blood in the water. This is a must-win for Scott Satterfield. He needs this game if they're going to keep this class together because, yes, NIL, that certainly is part of the landscape here in 2022. But, I mean, these kids probably want to know who their head coach is going to be next season, and Scott Satterfield needs this win.
I think the vultures are more than likely already circling Scott Satterfield, and not as much as job security, but on the recruiting trail. I mean, that is a very talented class, starting with the job that they've done out in California. You talk about DeAndre Moore, Pierce Clarkson as well, Madden Sanker from the state of Georgia. This is a very quality class that Louisville has put together, and drew a couple other guys down from the state of Florida, Stanquan Clark that we liked, William Fowles as well. So Louisville getting it done on the recruiting trail, but you got to win football games. And the Louisville experience, or excuse me, the Scott Satterfield experience at Louisville so far, I would say a little up and down and somewhat of a roller coaster. So we will see if they can win a big one against Central Florida this weekend. Drew, I'm going to go in the SEC, and I'm going to go Arkansas and South Carolina, a game that not a lot of people are talking about. I went back and I watched the condensed version of South Carolina this past week against Georgia State, and that was kind of a clunky game for them. They blocked 2 punts, get 2 special teams touchdowns. Spencer Rattler, to me, was a little bit up and down. And then Arkansas was a team that we thought had one of the more complete performances last weekend against a really good and top 25 ranked Cincinnati team. So Arkansas is going to be at home for this game, Drew, but you kind of take a step back from 30,000 feet, and these teams are pretty similar. I mean, you got Arkansas ranked with the number 16 ranked recruiting class right now. South Carolina just ahead of them. I think both teams have done a really good job establishing momentum. But this is a big game, and I think this is a really, really big game for Shane Beamer because next week they got Georgia coming to town to Columbia. And to me, if you find a way to split one of the next two, there's so much to be excited about, even if you don't win either of these games. But if you can pull that off, if you're Shane Beamer, I think they can keep the train rolling on the recruiting trail as well.
Well, if you're Shane Beamer, you want to be 2-0 going into next weekend when Nicholas Harbor comes to town? Or do you want to be 1-1? I think that's all you need to know right there. Now, this is a huge one. Interesting, you said it's there's similar programs in similar spots. They had really good off seasons. We like their recruiting classes, what they've done. More importantly, at the point of attack, I mean, both these guys realize if you're going to take down the Goliaths and the SEC, you got to be better up front, and they're doing that with their respective recruiting classes. I just think this is kind of a crossroad games. Your season can go one way. It can go in the right direction or the wrong direction. So that's why this one's so important. Won't get the national audience that maybe some of these other games should, but if you care about recruiting, program building, this is a big one in terms of momentum, optics, all that stuff. It's easier to sell 2-0 than it is 1-1 at this stage with 4 months to go before that early signing period.
Arkansas just gets better and better to me as a program. They continue to find an identity and get more confident, it seems. Kendall Briles, KJ Jefferson, some of the pieces that they've added via the transfer portal. You got to see that last week with Jaden Hazelwood and Drew Sanders as well. And for South Carolina, it's your first true road test of the season, going to the SEC West in a very hostile environment. And for you, you want to see how different of a team you are from last year. And I think Spencer Rattler is obviously going to be the part of this that kind of makes it go. So big game for South Carolina and the Gamecocks as well as the Razorbacks. We'll see how this one turns out, but going to be some recruiting implications on this one as well. But Drew, that's all I got, my friend. Any last words?
No, man, big weekend of football. Might not be a loaded week 2 slate when it comes to the colleges, but high schools down in South Florida, man, it's going to be wild. You got Miami Northwestern, Chaminade, Madonna tomorrow night at Traz-Pal. I'll be out there. And then on Friday night, Cardinal Gibbons, Gulliver Prep, Jalen Brown action, Daniel Harris, Davi Belfort. So I'm fired up. Big weekend of football coming.
I'll be down in New Orleans this weekend, back at home. Get to see Arch Manning against Riverside this weekend, so we'll get to see the #1 player live. And this will be my last week of Louisiana Wi-Fi. I'll trade that in for some Alabama Wi-Fi. So I don't know if that's going to be much better, but hopefully that will help with the lags. But for Andrew Ivins, I'm Cooper Petagna. As always, we appreciate you guys tuning in. And lastly, subscribe, like, comment, 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. So much going on, so much to like. And if you're a fanatic, this is the place to be. But we will see you next week, Monday, 3 o'clock Eastern. And thanks for joining us.